So the Arizona Game and Fish Department actually has two roles when it comes to a large forest fire like that. The first role is human safety, actually, above and beyond the wildlife safety, and we assisted the local agencies, DPS, Coconino County, the foresters themselves, with the evacuation of Oak Creek, and then we also assisted with security around the forest fire itself, and we are currently still have 5 officers that are out providing that security for the forest fire to keep the public out of the fire area, because everybody wants to go see what it looks like. And then also to keep the firefighters safe so that they can do their job without having the concern of the public being out there, getting in their way or accidentally being on the wrong side of a blind corner, that kind of thing. So we are currently doing that. As far as the wildlife aspect of it, we're monitoring the fire on a daily basis as far as any wildlife needs, any immediate wildlife needs. Luckily for us this year, the only immediate need that we saw was Sterling Springs Hatchery. And we put together a plan and worked with the fire team to get into Sterling Springs Hatchery during the first part of the slide fire. And we were able to rescue approximately 600,000 3-inch fish. So it's a huge number of our fish that would be stocked or will be stocked into the streams and lakes of Arizona. Those fish were moved to Page Springs Hatchery, and the Apache trout that we were growing at Sterling Springs were moved to Canyon Creek Hatchery.
Well, we're in the midst of a fish rescue operation to get 600,000 valuable trout out of the Sterling Springs fish hatchery and get them to other spots where there's not a fire.
That's 9.
Wednesday afternoon, things were getting pretty bad close to here. We could see flames less than a quarter mile from the hatchery on Wednesday afternoon when we left. The helicopter was dropping water real close to the hatchery. It was looking a little scary on Wednesday.
There's a lot had to happen before we got to the rescue. This fire is about 4 days old. It's over 10,000 acres. The incident management team here had to make sure that things were safe and that game and fish people could get in here and get out safely.
The fire danger here, the risk of silt and ash getting into the spring, just trying to save as many fish as we can, all of them hopefully, so that Arizona anglers still have trout to catch.
We still have a couple 100,000 smaller fingerlings there at the hatchery, and we're watching the weather as far as any monsoons, flooding, or water that would put sediment into the water and be detrimental to our fish. So we're watching that on a daily basis, and whether or not we need to move those fish, we're making that decision every day. The reason that we didn't move those fish, they're really small, and it's not easy to move the fish at that size. They're less than 1 inch long, and equipment-wise, the jeopardy to the fish themselves, it's just difficult, and we thought it would be wise to leave them there for now. As far as the larger animals, the way the slide fire was, we actually got pretty lucky, and we haven't found or seen any detrimental effects to the larger animals, elk, deer, bears, coyotes, those kind of things. And so we are currently monitoring that on a daily basis, and that's where we stand at this point.
So the animals, the bears and the deer and the elk and so forth, do they pretty much scatter and get out of the way of the fire, or I mean, they take run, or do they like? Ah?
As long as they're not trapped, fire on all sides, then they actually will move out of the fire area. We did see a lot of animals. We had closed 89A for the fire, and there were a lot of animals that came out to the 89A corridor. And then up on top, the Woody Mountain Road, all the way out to Harding Point and East Pocket in that country, we saw a lot of deer and elk that were right on the edge of the fire. And they move themselves, if they can, out of the immediate danger. And then what's interesting is now that the fire is, I believe, 90% contained as of yesterday, there's a lot of black and ash through the forest, mostly backburn, which was actually really good for the habitat. Those animals will actually start to move back into that fire area, and we'll see them in there licking up the ash and getting the minerals from the burned vegetation. So.
In terms of the aquatic environment, most of the impacts that you're going to see are really not during the fire, but after. A lot of these fish, especially since it's my understanding that much of that riparian zone wasn't heavily impacted, a lot of these fish didn't even know that there was a fire. And so you're talking about the food for the fish, the aquatic invertebrates, as long as the native and sport fish species that we have in there. The impacts that we would expect to see from this fire would be after the fact. As the monsoon season comes in, or the rain, and some of this ash and some of the sediment starts coming into the system, it can have long-term and short-term effects on aquatic ecosystems. The short-term effects would be when this ash starts coming off of these hills. It can change the water quality, and you can have everything from moderate impacts to heavy impacts to aquatic resources. We could see some fish kills depending on where this early rain is, how intense it is, and whether it's over a what we would consider a high intensity fire or a low intensity part of the fire, and whether it's on steep slopes or up on the tops. And so it really depends on the intensity of the fire and where some of those first rains occur and how the sediments and the ash come off the hill. In terms of the short-term impacts, there's not a lot that you can do in some of these real steep areas when you're talking about basically ash slurry coming down. It's going to come down. Now, depending on how quickly it comes down, where it comes down, will determine what impacts and where those impacts are. In the long term, there are some mitigation measures that I'll be discussing with Larry and others that might be possible in some of these other areas. And I know that there's discussions already, but it's still a little early to know exactly what those mitigation measures will be. If some of these areas, if the precipitation comes off slowly and instead of rapidly, a lot of the sediments get trapped before they get into the system. And so it's the rate at which the sediments come down. And so anything you can do to slow that down will help.
It's going to be the after effect, and it's really going to determine what Mother Nature throws at us. Is it going to be light rains or is it going to be heavy rains? And so depending on how much sediment ends up in Oak Creek itself will be the determining factor. Mm-hmm. The narrow-headed garter snake, which is soon to be a listed snake, which is along Oak Creek, is at risk depending on what happens to the creek and what happens to its food source, the fish that are in the creek. And so there's been a lot of discussions as to what we should do about that. But as far as other larger terrestrial animals, the way the fire was, they're actually going to take care of themselves. And so we'll again monitor and see if anything ends up down in Oak Creek in places where they shouldn't. But for the most part, we expect the wildlife here with the slide fire to actually handle this on their own fairly well. Oh, well, we get bears are the ones that we get called on the most. We get calls on bears in Oak Creek on a yearly basis, usually coming into the apple orchards or, coming into the trash that hasn't been dumped yet, that kind of thing. And then we have procedures to deal with the bear depending on what the circumstances are. But as far as other larger animals, you can see white-tailed deer, mule deer. Occasionally you'll see an elk, coyotes, and then skunks and raccoons, the smaller little critters that you'll see in Oak Creek as well. We're still waiting on the fire severity map to see exactly where the hot burns were and where the moderate burns were and where the light burns were. They're actually out there today. The rehabilitation team from the Forest Service and such are out there ground truthing their map, making sure their map is correct so that we can use that map as a management tool to determine what we need to do here in the next few weeks and months. But being out on the fire, there are definitely some hot spots. We saw the smoke. Those are where the hot spots are. The actual along the creek, North of Slide Rock, yeah, it got burned pretty good. But that's just a small section of the entire fire. The fire was over 20,000 acres. And when you drive 89A, if you weren't aware that there was a fire before you got to the Slide Rock area, you wouldn't know, because the firefighters did such an excellent job of keeping it away from the houses and keeping it away from the creek. The fire up on top, the outer perimeter, they used backburn to contain the fire, and they did it at night, and they did an excellent job, and it really looks very good as far as future habitat. It's going to increase the grass growth, which is going to be great for the wildlife. It's going to be a great improvement for the wildlife and their habitat in the long run. So, yeah, there's some severe sections of the burn that we'll have to deal with for the next 5 to 10 years, but there's also some really good stuff that we're going to see some great rehab in the, as soon as the rain comes, we'll probably see some grass growing back up through that. So.
Well, there may be some folks with some concerns with that sport fishery up there. The sport fishery might change. That is a very important sport fishery to the state of Arizona. I know a lot of people enjoy it. It's a popular fly fishing area. And the nature of that sport fishery could change.
What area is this? I'm not familiar.
Basically from Slide Rock going up canyons where you see a lot of fly fishing anglers, and it's a very precious place to some of those. Okay. Self-sustaining population of rainbow trout and brown trout in there. And we'll be monitoring that closely to see what impacts, the long-term or short-term impacts we'll have to that fishery, and do our best to help that recover as quickly as possible.
So, do the fire people, a lot of the issue is sediments flowing and ash flowing into the creek. So are the fire people then doing some activity to try and prevent runoff as much as possible?
They absolutely are, and that's the recovery team that I'm talking about. It's a bear team, and they come in after most of all of the major forest fires in the United States. And they come in, and that is their main purpose, is to look at and mitigate any potential future hazards. In this situation, runoff and hydrology is a huge one because of the canyon, the steepness of the slopes, Oak Creek itself, and so there's a lot of different things that they can do, whether it's reseeding, throwing down substrate to prevent or slow the ash or catch the sediment from coming down. They can only work on certain slopes. When it gets too steep, there's not a lot they can do, as Scott mentioned, but they can actually put stuff on top of the steep slopes to slow or catch any sediment that would be above it, so that it doesn't come rushing down, and then they get it at the bottom as well. And so they are currently looking at those measures, and we're tied in with them, and we'll be able to work with what they come up with, and hopefully mitigate and reduce any impacts that it has on the creek here in the future.
Scott, closing?
Well, we'll just be watching for long-term impacts after we get through the monsoon season in terms of the aquatic part of this. We're hoping that there won't be any severe long-term impacts from some of the stuff we learned from the wall of fire. If you have intense changes to aquatic food bases and habitat, some of those can take quite a while to recover and to be in the same shape that they were prior to the fire. We're crossing our fingers and hoping that this monsoon season treats us well and we have a quick recovery.
Larry?
Did what he said.